When a simple parked truck sparks a suburban showdown, one man's defiance against a tyrannical HOA queen ignites a war of control, secrets, and unexpected alliances that could change the neighborhood forever. The screech of tires and the sharp slam of my truck door echoed through the cul-de-sac like a gunshot just as Karen came storming out of her manicured front yard in a floral sundress that looked 2 sizes too small for her temper. Her voice, shrill and demanding, sliced through the thick summer air as she shrieked, "You have 30 seconds to move that rusty heap or my guests will have your head on a platter." And all I could do was stare back at her, one foot on the curb, one hand gripping my coffee, wondering how on earth I'd become the villain in a story where the crime was parking my own truck in front of my own house. Her garden party was in full swing, pastel balloons tied to white chairs, a table full of hors d'oeuvres lined up like soldiers on parade, and yet all eyes were on me as the so-called monster who had ruined her perfect HOA event by daring to take up space. The standoff lasted seconds, but the tension clung to the air like smoke, her face turning a deeper shade of red than the strawberries on her dessert platter, while her perfectly groomed friends whispered behind their champagne glasses as if I'd set fire to their entire afternoon by refusing to bow down to Karen's demands. Imagine a single parked truck igniting a suburban war that exposes years of hidden tyranny. That's how it all began, pulling you into the chaos of control, defiance, and unexpected alliances. 2 hours earlier, my day had started like any other, with no warning that it would erupt into a neighborhood battlefield. I had returned from a long-haul job. Dust still clinging to my clothes, my eyes heavy from a 14-hour drive. My truck, my pride and joy, was my livelihood. And the only thing I wanted after days on the road was to park it where it belonged in front of my home, shower off the miles of asphalt, and catch a nap before unpacking. The last thing on my mind was a neighborhood soiree or an HOA event of the season. But this wasn't just any neighborhood. This was Karen's kingdom, where every front yard had to be Pinterest perfect, every fence white and gleaming, every guest list approved by her invisible committee. She had been the self-appointed queen since the day I moved in, dictating what color your shutters could be, and what hours you could mow your own lawn, and I had learned to keep my head down to avoid her radar. Today, however, fate shoved me straight into her crosshairs. It started with the first wave of SUVs and luxury sedans lining the street, valets nowhere in sight, guests tottering in high heels toward Karen's pastel paradise. I barely noticed until I turned the corner and found my driveway blocked by a rented catering van. With no other choice, I parked directly in front of my home, a spot I had used 100 times before, only to hear the first muffled gasp from across the lawn as Karen spotted my truck like a hunter spotting prey. I could practically hear her internal alarm bells ringing as she adjusted her straw hat and power walked over, clutching her clipboard like it was a royal decree. "Excuse me," she said with a sweetness so fake it could rot teeth. "This is not a good place for that today. My guests need parking." I had barely stepped out of the cab when the demand followed. "You'll have to move it somewhere else." Somewhere else meant 2 streets over, a half-mile walk back home, and leaving my tools and haul unsecured. I tried reason, explaining that this was my house, my spot, my truck. But Karen wasn't listening. She was scanning her rows of imported roses, probably imagining the photos her friends would post online with my truck ruining her aesthetic. Every second I stood my ground. Her smile slipped further until the claws came out. "You can't just park here when I have an event. This neighborhood has rules." That was her mantra. Rules this, rules that. But the HOA handbook had nothing about sacrificing your own parking for her champagne brunch. By mid-afternoon, her irritation had turned into an obsession. She circled like a hawk, whispering to her guests, calling someone on her phone, glaring at me from her picket fence lawn. I ignored her, hauled my bags inside, and figured that would be the end of it. I underestimated Karen's love for a scene. 30 minutes before the guests arrived in droves, she marched to my door, banged so hard the hinges rattled, and delivered her ultimatum. Move the truck or suffer the wrath of the HOA. It was laughable, ridiculous, but there was something about the fire in her eyes that hinted she wasn't bluffing. She lived for control, and my truck had just shattered her perfect picture of suburban supremacy. As the party started and music floated across the lawns, I stayed inside sipping coffee, hoping the storm would pass. But Karen didn't believe in losing. She recruited 2 of her minions. Other board members in sundresses and pearl necklaces to corner me outside, their passive-aggressive smiles sharp enough to cut glass. They insisted I was ruining everything, that her high-profile guest from the city council couldn't possibly walk past that ugly thing in front of her house. I refused again, not out of spite, but principle. My property wasn't a public parking lot. And the thought of moving it just to please a power-hungry neighbor made my blood boil. And so came the explosion. The moment captured in every whisper and phone camera on the block. Karen screaming, demanding, pointing as if exorcising a demon while I stood calm and unmoving, my truck gleaming under the sun like a monument to defiance. That was the spark that would ignite a week-long war between a woman desperate for control and a man done with being pushed around. What no one knew in that moment, not even me, was just how far Karen was willing to go to punish me, or how many secrets her perfect little kingdom was hiding. What started as a petty parking dispute would spiral into sabotage, lies, police involvement, HOA scandals, and a finale that would leave the entire neighborhood questioning why they'd ever let Karen hold the crown. But standing there in that first standoff, coffee in hand, eyes locked with hers, I only knew one thing. I wasn't moving that truck, no matter how much she screamed. The morning after the showdown felt like waking up on a battlefield. Only the war hadn't ended. It had merely paused for the night, ready to erupt with renewed force as soon as the sun rose. My phone buzzed nonstop with texts from a few neighbors I barely knew. Some amused, some warning me that Karen was furious and already plotting her next move. As I peeked through the blinds, I caught sight of her standing at the edge of her lawn with a cup of tea in one hand and her ever-present clipboard in the other, flanked by two of her closest allies. Their heads were bent together, their expressions grim, as though they were discussing a crime scene rather than a parked truck. It would have been comical if it weren't so unsettling. Karen had power in this neighborhood. Not official power, but the kind that came from years of intimidation, gossip, and carefully manipulated HOA votes. I knew refusing to move my truck wasn't just a single act of defiance. It was a declaration of independence in a community where independence wasn't tolerated. I tried to ignore the drama and focus on my own business, but Karen made that impossible. Before breakfast was done, a folded piece of paper appeared on my windshield, wedged under the wiper blade like a silent threat. It wasn't an official notice, just a handwritten demand in looping cursive that said, "Your vehicle is a blight on this neighborhood. Move it within the hour or I'll have it towed at your expense." The note wasn't signed, but it didn't need to be. Only Karen would have the audacity to treat a public street in front of someone else's house like her private driveway. I crumpled the paper and tossed it aside, figuring she'd cool off eventually. Instead, she escalated. By noon, two strangers in neon vests strolled up and started snapping pictures of my truck from every angle, claiming they'd been called in for an assessment. When I asked who called them, they shrugged and said they were contractors investigating a complaint about an unsightly vehicle damaging property values. It was absurd, even by HOA standards, and I could see Karen standing smugly in her yard pretending to prune roses while watching the whole scene unfold. I told the contractors to leave and reminded them this was public parking in front of my property, not her personal event venue. They grumbled and left, but the message was clear. Karen had declared war, and she was willing to throw every ounce of her influence at me until I surrendered. The situation took another twist when a few neighbors started taking sides. Mrs. Hensley from 2 houses down ambled over with a tray of cookies, whispering that she thought Karen had gone too far, that this wasn't the first time she'd bullied someone over her events. Apparently, last year she had made another neighbor move his camper during a holiday barbecue. And the year before that she tried to have a teenager's beat-up sedan towed before a garden club meeting. Karen's tyranny wasn't new. It was just that most people complied to avoid her wrath. Now that I had stood my ground, others were secretly cheering me on, but only from the safety of their porches. Publicly, they stayed quiet, afraid of Karen's retaliation. It was a strange feeling becoming the reluctant hero in a suburban standoff. But there was no turning back now. The drama came to a head that afternoon when I heard shouting outside. Karen had cornered another neighbor, Steve, accusing him of conspiring with me because he hadn't moved his own truck yet either. I stepped outside just as she was waving her arms, screaming about HOA rules that didn't exist, claiming she had authority to enforce order. Steve, usually mild-mannered, finally snapped and told her to mind her own business. The look on her face was priceless, a mix of shock and fury, as if rebellion was contagious, and she couldn't allow it to spread. She whirled on me then, pointing a trembling finger and shouting that my truck was destroying the neighborhood's reputation and that I'd be hearing from the board soon. The crowd that had gathered pretended to look away, but I caught the smirks and suppressed laughter. Karen had wanted a public humiliation for me, but she ended up giving the neighborhood a show instead, one that didn't go her way. Still, I knew better than to underestimate her. That evening, a certified letter slid under my door stamped with the HOA logo. It cited made-up infractions claiming my vehicle violated vague community guidelines and threatened fines if I didn't comply. It was nonsense, and I had every intention of fighting it. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Karen didn't play fair. She played to win, and she thrived on drama. The garden party fiasco had embarrassed her in front of her friends, and she wasn't the type to forgive or forget. She wanted a victory, and she wanted me to be the one crawling back to her, begging for peace. As night fell, I sat on my porch, staring at the truck, running through my options. Moving it would solve nothing. It would only cement Karen's belief that she ruled this neighborhood. Standing my ground meant more battles, more harassment, maybe even legal nonsense. But there was something almost exhilarating about refusing to bow down, about finally being the one to say no to someone who'd been unchecked for years. The tension in the air was electric, the whole street waiting to see who would win, who would break first. I wasn't going anywhere, and neither was my truck. I had no idea just how far Karen was willing to go to force my hand. But deep down, I knew this wasn't just about parking anymore. This was about control. And for the first time since I moved into this HOA nightmare, someone was daring to take it back. The war lines had been drawn, and Chapter 1 was only the first shot fired. The next morning, the entire neighborhood felt different, as though an invisible tension had been stretched over every house and driveway, ready to snap at any moment. Birds still chirped, sprinklers still hissed, and kids still rode bikes down the street. Yet beneath that suburban calmness, there was a charge in the air that had nothing to do with the weather. I opened my curtains to see Karen already pacing her lawn in her bathrobe, phone pressed to her ear, gesturing wildly as she spoke to whoever was unfortunate enough to be on the other end. The night before, after the HOA letter arrived, I'd called my brother to vent, and he'd warned me this was how people like Karen operated. They didn't care about being right or wrong. They only cared about winning. And they used intimidation, gossip, and fake rules to get their way. I could feel his words echoing in my mind as I stepped outside, knowing full well that this wasn't going to just blow over. The first sign that today would be worse than yesterday came when I found another piece of paper taped to my front door. This one typed in an official-looking font with a bold heading that read, "Final Warning." It claimed that my truck was a hazardous obstruction, that it violated safety codes, and that the HOA had the right to have it forcibly removed. The ridiculousness of it all would have been funny if it wasn't also infuriating. My truck was legally parked on public property and had never once caused an accident or blocked traffic. I knew it. She knew it. And yet, here she was escalating her campaign like a dictator drafting propaganda. I crumpled the letter and tossed it inside, telling myself I wouldn't let it get to me. But Karen was relentless, and her persistence had a way of seeping into every corner of my day. By mid-morning, she had gathered a small group of her loyal followers on her front porch, sipping coffee and shooting glances toward my house as they murmured to one another. The performance was almost theatrical, the way Karen waved her hands, pointing toward my truck, shaking her head as if I were lowering property values by the second. It wasn't long before one of them, a wiry man named Glenn, who'd lived here forever and loved reminding newcomers of it, shuffled over to my yard with his hands in his pockets and an awkward smile plastered on his face. He said Karen was just concerned about appearances and maybe I could be a good neighbor and move the truck for the sake of peace. His voice was soft, but his eyes flicked nervously toward Karen like he was delivering a message on behalf of a mafia boss. I thanked him for his advice, but told him plainly that I wasn't moving my own vehicle from in front of my own house just because someone thought it clashed with their party decorations. He sighed, nodded, and shuffled back across the street, clearly knowing it wasn't his fight to win. Not long after, the first real twist of the day arrived in the form of a tow truck rumbling slowly down the road. My heart skipped a beat as I watched it approach, only for it to stop right behind my pickup. Karen strutted toward the driver like a queen addressing her servant, clipboard in hand, barking instructions about illegal parking. I was out the door in seconds, shouting before they even tried hooking anything up. The tow truck driver, clearly uncomfortable, held up his hands and said he was just responding to a call about an abandoned vehicle. I pointed out that I was standing right there, that the truck was registered, insured, legally parked, and certainly not abandoned. When I asked who had called him, he gave a helpless glance toward Karen, who stood off to the side, pretending to scroll on her phone, and said he couldn't disclose that information, but it was obviously a misunderstanding. I made sure the misunderstanding ended right there, threatening legal action if anyone touched my truck without proper authority. The driver quickly backed off, muttering about wasted time, while Karen stomped her foot and shouted that the HOA would hear about this. The scene drew more spectators this time, with curtains twitching and a few brave neighbors standing on their lawns watching the chaos unfold. One even recorded it on their phone, probably knowing it would make for juicy drama at the next meeting, or better yet, go viral online. As the tow truck pulled away, Karen stormed toward me, finger wagging, her voice rising higher and higher about rules, community spirit, respect for events, until she was practically screeching. I stayed calm, which only seemed to infuriate her more, and finally told her in a firm voice that this nonsense needed to stop. I reminded her the street didn't belong to her. The HOA didn't make traffic laws, and if she tried to tow my truck again without legal grounds, she'd be the one facing trouble. The silence that followed was thick enough to cut with a knife every eye in the street on us, every breath held. For a split second, I thought maybe she'd back down. Instead, she smirked, the kind of smirk that said this was far from over, and turned on her heel with a dramatic spin of her sundress, heading back to her house like a villain plotting the next act. The rest of the afternoon was eerily quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that comes before a storm. I kept busy with yard work, partly to calm my nerves and partly to show I wasn't intimidated. Across the street, Karen's blinds twitched every few minutes, her silhouette pacing back and forth. Around dinner time, another surprise landed on my doorstep. A summon to an emergency HOA meeting scheduled for the next evening, with my behavior listed as the main topic of discussion. The absurdity of it made me laugh out loud. My behavior, all I had done was park in front of my own house, yet Karen had twisted it into a community crisis worthy of a tribunal. Still, I knew this wasn't a joke. She controlled that board and would likely try to fine me, humiliate me, maybe even start legal proceedings just to prove a point. That night, I called a friend who was a lawyer, explained the situation, and he promised to help me draft responses to anything they tried to pull. He warned me Karen's tactics bordered on harassment, and that I had every right to push back hard. As I hung up, I felt a spark of determination replacing the frustration. If Karen wanted a war, she'd picked the wrong person to bully this time. I wasn't moving my truck. I wasn't bending to fake rules. And I wasn't going to let her intimidate me out of my own right. The neighborhood had seen her tyranny for years, but now they were watching something different, a fight she couldn't easily win. As I locked up for the night, lights flickering in Karen's windows like a villain's lair in a movie, I knew the coming HOA meeting wasn't just going to be another shouting match. It was going to be the next major battle in a suburban war that had started over a parking space, but was slowly unearthing something deeper. A challenge to Karen's long-standing reign of control, a challenge she couldn't afford to lose, and one I was more than ready to see through to the end. The next evening arrived heavy with anticipation, as if the entire neighborhood was holding its breath for the spectacle that everyone knew was coming. The so-called emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for 7 sharp in the clubhouse at the end of the street, a place that usually hosted tame bake sales or dull committee gatherings about lawn regulations and mailbox colors. Tonight, though, it felt more like a courtroom. Every seat filled with curious neighbors eager to witness Karen's latest power play and my refusal to bend to it. I walked in with my head high, legal pad in hand, heart thumping in my chest, not out of fear, but from the tension of knowing this was the showdown Karen had been building towards since the moment I refused to move my truck. She was already there, perched at the head of the long conference table like a self-appointed judge, gavel in hand, even though there had never been one at past meetings. Her expression was smug, her allies flanking her like loyal soldiers, whispering and glancing my way as if I were some dangerous outsider rather than their neighbor. The meeting began with Karen dramatically reading a list of fabricated grievances, her voice dripping with fake concern as she accused me of disrupting community harmony, violating unwritten standards, and disrespecting the sanctity of HOA events. She painted a picture of me as some unruly menace, a reckless truck owner ruining property values and terrorizing guests, conveniently leaving out the fact that I was legally parked in front of my own home and had only refused her unreasonable demands. Every sentence was a performance designed to rile the crowd and remind everyone who supposedly ran this neighborhood. Some of her followers nodded obediently, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, clearly aware this was overblown nonsense, but unwilling to cross Karen publicly. When it was my turn to speak, I stood and laid out the facts calmly, every word deliberate and steady. I pointed out the lack of any written rule against where I parked, the absence of any safety hazard, and the reality that this entire feud started because one person thought her party mattered more than her neighbor's right. I mentioned the fake letters, the contractors harassing me, the tow truck stunt, and how far beyond neighborly concern this had gone. The room was silent except for the occasional cough, and I could see cracks forming in Karen's control as some board members exchanged uneasy looks. For years, she'd relied on intimidation to get her way, but faced with someone who refused to cower and could back up his stance, her empire suddenly seemed less invincible. Karen tried to interrupt, slamming her hand on the table and shouting about community image, insisting that my truck was an eyesore that offended visitors and potential buyers. I countered by pulling up state and HOA regulations on my phone, reading aloud the parts that proved she had no authority to dictate where a resident could legally park. The crowd shifted again, murmurs rippling through the room as people realized Karen had been bluffing all along. Her face turned the same shade of pink it had during the garden party standoff. But instead of backing down, she doubled down, threatening fines and legal action, claiming she had already spoken to a lawyer who supported her stance. I called her bluff on the spot, stating I had consulted legal counsel, too, and any attempt to tow or fine me unlawfully would land her and the HOA in serious trouble. The tension was thick, the battle of wills palpable, until an unexpected voice broke through the noise. Mrs. Hensley, the sweet elderly neighbor who had brought me cookies days ago, stood up slowly and called out Karen for years of bullying. She spoke about how everyone had been too scared to speak up. How Karen had made life miserable for anyone who didn't follow her personal whims disguised as rules, and how this nonsense about my truck was just the latest example. The room erupted in quiet gasps, more neighbors nodding, whispering their agreement. For the first time, Karen looked rattled, her eyes darting around the room as her carefully constructed narrative slipped out of her control. Sensing momentum, I added that this wasn't just about a truck. It was about a pattern of harassment that needed to stop. I proposed that the HOA start following actual written rules instead of Karen's word, that residents have a say in decisions affecting their own property, and that intimidation tactics have no place in a supposedly friendly community. Applause broke out in the back, tentative at first, but growing louder as people realized they didn't have to stay silent anymore. Karen's face twisted in fury, her voice shrieking over the noise that this was her neighborhood, her standards, her rules. But no one seemed as convinced as they once were. The meeting ended without a resolution, Karen storming out in a flurry of angry mutters about ungrateful neighbors and troublemakers ruining perfection. But everyone knew something had shifted. For years she had ruled through fear. But tonight that fear cracked, replaced by the possibility of change. As I walked out, several neighbors clapped me on the shoulder, whispered their thanks for standing up to her. Even Steve, who had been shouted at days earlier, promised he'd back me up if Karen tried anything else. It felt like a small victory, but I knew Karen wasn't done. People like her didn't lose gracefully. She would plot, scheme, and come back swinging harder than before, desperate to regain control and make me pay for challenging her throne. Later that night, back home on my porch, I watched the street under the glow of the lampposts. My truck parked defiantly where it had always been, a silent declaration that I wasn't going anywhere. Karen's blinds stayed shut, but I could almost feel her eyes burning holes through the glass, already drafting her next move. Maybe it would be another fake violation notice. Maybe some kind of smear campaign. Maybe another tow truck stunt. Whatever it was, I'd be ready because this battle had grown into something bigger than me versus her. It was about every neighbor who'd been pushed around. Every time someone gave up their right to live peacefully just to avoid her wrath, I wasn't about to let her win that war, no matter how messy it got. And deep down, I suspected the messiest part was still to come. The next few days rolled in heavy with unease, the kind of unease you can't quite put your finger on, but can feel deep in your gut. the HOA meeting might have ended without a clear winner. But it had left the neighborhood buzzing, rumors flying, alliances shifting. Some neighbors nodded at me more warmly now, their smiles small but sincere, as if grateful that someone had finally stood up to Karen, while others still kept their distance, unwilling to risk her wrath. As for Karen herself, she had gone strangely quiet. Her front yard, usually a stage for her theatrics, seemed abandoned, except for the occasional glimpse of her silhouette behind the curtains. But silence from someone like Karen wasn't a sign of peace. It was a sign that she was planning something bigger, something nastier, the kind of retaliation that would make all the previous nonsense look like child's play. And sure enough, it didn't take long for her next move to come crashing down like a hammer. It started with a letter, this time not handwritten or casually typed, but dressed up to look official, sealed in an envelope bearing the HOA's logo. Inside was a notice claiming that my truck was not just unsightly, but a public safety hazard, and that it would be forcibly removed if I didn't comply within 48 hours. The wording was more aggressive than before, dripping with threats of legal fees and irreversible consequences. The kicker was that it was signed not just by Karen, but by two other board members I had thought were more reasonable. It felt like an ambush, as though Karen had leaned on them, twisted their arms, promised them something in exchange for joining her crusade. My lawyer friend assured me the notice was still baseless, that they had no authority to tow a legally parked vehicle on a public street, but it didn't matter. The intent was clear. Karen wanted me scared, wanted me scrambling to move the truck just to avoid the headache. And most of all, she wanted to remind everyone that defying her came with a price. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky orange, I saw another tow truck cruise slowly down the street, circling like a shark, sniffing blood. This time, I stood outside, leaning against my truck, arms folded, phone camera ready, daring them to try it. The driver rolled down his window and called out that he'd received a call about a dangerous leaking vehicle. I laughed a short, sharp sound and told him to check for himself that there wasn't a drop of oil anywhere. He did reluctantly muttered about wasting his time and drove off. Across the street, Karen stood on her porch pretending to water her flowers, fury etched across her face as her plan unraveled before her eyes. I made sure to wave before heading inside, knowing the small act of defiance would eat at her more than any words could. But Karen's war wasn't limited to tow trucks and letters anymore. Over the next 2 days, small annoyances began piling up like she was trying to wear me down through sheer persistence. My trash cans were mysteriously knocked over each morning, spilling garbage across the curb. Flyers about community harmony and proper aesthetics appeared on my lawn overnight. A neighbor I barely knew sheepishly admitted Karen had been going door to door telling people my truck was dangerous, polluting, a nuisance that could hurt children playing nearby. It was absurd and transparent yet effective in its own way, planting seeds of doubt and annoyance among people who just wanted peace. And while I ignored most of it, pretending her antics didn't faze me, the truth was that living under constant siege took its toll. Every time I stepped outside, I felt eyes on me, waiting to see what would happen next, whether I'd finally give in or if Karen would escalate to something even more outrageous. The breaking point came one humid afternoon when I returned from running errands to find my truck covered in sticky notes plastered across every window and door. Each one carried a nasty message in different handwriting. Obviously the work of Karen's little entourage. Move it already. Ugly trucks don't belong here. Respect your neighbors. The childishness of it all might have been laughable if it weren't also infuriating. I peeled the notes off slowly, methodically, aware that Karen was watching from her window, probably hoping I'd explode in anger and make a scene she could twist into more ammunition. Instead, I collected every last note, shoved them in a folder, and made a silent promise to myself that this nonsense wasn't going to go unanswered. That night, I called for backup. My brother, a man who'd never been afraid of confrontation, agreed to come by the next day with his own truck, parking it right behind mine in solidarity. A friend from work who had witnessed Karen's antics before promised to swing by as well, bringing cameras to document everything in case this war went further. If Karen wanted to turn this into a public battle, I'd give her a show, one where her bullying couldn't be hidden or spun into lies anymore. And deep down, I knew this was the only language someone like her understood. Strength, resistance, refusing to bow, no matter how many tricks she pulled. The next morning, when Karen emerged, expecting to see me frazzled and defeated, she instead found my driveway lined with two massive trucks, both parked legally, both immovable. My brother leaned casually against his hood, sipping coffee, while I stood beside him, chatting like nothing was wrong. The look on Karen's face was priceless. A mixture of outrage and disbelief, her hands balling into fists at her sides before she stormed back inside without a word. Minutes later, my phone pinged with yet another message from the HOA. This one declaring an urgent safety review of heavy vehicles in the neighborhood. It was laughable, desperate, even proof that Karen had lost control of the narrative and was throwing every last card she had on the table in hopes something would stick. By midday, half the neighborhood had wandered by, some offering quiet words of support, others just curious about the growing standoff. Steve grinned as he walked past, telling me I'd started a revolution, that maybe people would finally stop letting Karen run everything unchecked. The thought made me smile, not because I wanted to be a hero, but because it felt like change was finally possible. That standing my ground was bigger than one parking dispute. Yet, even as I stood there feeling a rare moment of victory, I knew it wasn't over. Karen's kind didn't quit. They schemed, they plotted, they waited for the perfect chance to strike back harder. And as the sun set over our quiet cul-de-sac, my gut told me she was planning something far more dangerous than sticky notes and fake violations, something that would turn this suburban feud into an all-out war neither of us could walk away from unscathed. The next day dawned unusually quiet, an unsettling kind of quiet that carried weight in the air and hinted at trouble brewing beneath the surface. Karen's house sat still, curtains drawn. No sign of her pacing or plotting in plain sight the way she usually did, but I could feel it in my bones that she hadn't given up. People like Karen never retreated. They only regroup. I went about my morning routine with one eye on the street, coffee in hand, every nerve on edge, waiting for the next ridiculous stunt, wondering how far she would go this time to regain the control she had lost. My brother had stayed the night, insisting it wasn't safe for me to face her brand of suburban warfare alone anymore. And together we stood in the driveway, watching the neighborhood stir to life. A few neighbors gave me discreet nods of solidarity, the kind they wouldn't dare give if Karen were watching. Proof that the tide was turning, but not fast enough to stop whatever madness she was planning. By noon, the first strike landed. Not in the form of tow trucks or sticky notes this time, but a full-blown city code enforcement officer pulling up to my house. The man, clipboard in hand, introduced himself politely enough, but made it clear he was responding to multiple complaints about large commercial vehicles creating safety hazards. My brother and I exchanged a look, both of us knowing exactly who had made those complaints. Karen was hiding behind the system now, weaponizing official channels to scare me into submission. I walked the officer through everything, showed him my registration, pointed out that my truck was legally parked on a public street and in no way blocking traffic or driveways. The man seemed almost embarrassed to be there, admitted he had been called 3 times in 24 hours by the same anonymous source, and finally promised to close the complaint as unfounded. He drove off, shaking his head, muttering that some people had too much free time. From across the street, Karen's blinds snapped shut the second his car disappeared. Proof that she had been watching the whole exchange and stewing over another failed attempt to crush me under her imaginary authority. But Karen wasn't done, and by late afternoon, she unveiled her most desperate move yet. As I worked on my truck in the driveway, tightening a few bolts that had rattled loose during my last haul, a stranger approached holding a stack of flyers. He introduced himself as a representative of a local real estate group and sheepishly admitted he had been hired to canvass the neighborhood about problematic residents lowering property values. He handed me a flyer that had my house number printed on it alongside a photo of my truck captioned with words like unsafe and unneighborly behavior hurting our community. My blood boiled as I realized Karen had stooped to publicly smearing my name, distributing libel to every house on the block in an attempt to turn the neighborhood against me. The man apologized, said he was just doing his job, and that an HOA board member had paid for the campaign. My brother snatched a flyer from his hands, ripped it in two, and told him to leave before he became part of Karen's circus. Within the hour, I could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on me as neighbors read the filth Karen had spread. Some looked ashamed, others confused, a few even angry on my behalf. Mrs. Hensley marched straight over with her copy, waving it like a flag of rebellion, telling me it was the last straw and that she was done letting Karen run this place like a tyrant. Steve soon joined, muttering that if Karen thought bullying one guy was going to scare everyone else, she was about to learn a hard lesson. The 3 of us stood in my driveway, forming a small but determined alliance. And for the first time, I saw real cracks forming in Karen's reign. People were whispering not about my truck anymore, but about her obsession, her harassment, how far she was willing to go to destroy a neighbor over nothing. It was a shift in power, subtle but undeniable, and Karen must have felt it because that evening, just as the sun dipped below the rooftops, she came storming across the street for a direct confrontation. Her face was flushed, voice shrill, hands waving wildly as she screamed that I was poisoning the neighborhood with my rebellion, that I had turned people against her, that I had no respect for the rules or for her years of hard work maintaining our community's prestige. My brother stepped forward, calm but firm, telling her this had gone far enough, that what she was doing wasn't leadership, but harassment, plain and simple. Neighbors began gathering on their porches, watching as Karen ranted about how I was ruining everything, how my truck symbolized chaos, how I had to be stopped before the neighborhood fell apart. The desperation in her tone betrayed her fear. She was losing control and everyone could see it. I let her finish her tirade before responding, my voice steady, but loud enough for every witness to hear. I told her this was no longer about a parking spot, but about basic rights, about living free from bullying and false rules, about neighbors supporting each other instead of bending to one person's delusional need for power. I promised that if her harassment didn't stop, I would not only involve law enforcement, but take her and the HOA to court for damages. A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd, and for the first time, Karen had no quick comeback. She stood there trembling with rage, eyes darting around, realizing she no longer had unanimous support. The moment was tense, electric, a turning point where Karen's long reign of intimidation teetered on the brink of collapse. She finally spun on her heel and stormed home, slamming her door so hard it echoed down the street. A hush lingered for a moment before neighbors began clapping softly, hesitantly at first, but growing louder as courage spread. Steve slapped my shoulder. Mrs. Hensley smiled warmly. Others nodded approvingly, all of them silently thanking me for standing up when they hadn't been able to for so long. The night air felt lighter somehow, a weight lifting from the block as people realized Karen wasn't untouchable anymore. Still, I knew better than to believe it was over. People like Karen didn't quit. They plotted. They schemed. They came back with nastier tricks. But for the first time since this ridiculous war began, I felt hope that this wouldn't just end in me winning the right to park my truck. It could end in Karen finally losing the power she had abused for years. And that thought made every ounce of stress and every sleepless night worth it. As I sat on my porch under the stars, truck safely parked where it had always been, I felt ready for whatever final stunt Karen was preparing because now I wasn't standing alone. And that changed everything.